Thanks very much, Linda. And thanks everyone for listening today. In May 2002, around the time I was completing my Master of Music in Composition with one of my now composer education heroes, Anne Boyd, another composer education hero of mine, Matthew Heinsohn, yeah, they're all staff here, so I've got to mention them, asked me if I would cover his position as the composer in residence at MLC School in Burwood. I'd been doing a bit of undergraduate guest lecturing at the time, and Matthew assured me that high school teaching was much easier. So a week later, I turned up at the school and met the infamous Karen Carey, and Matthew asked me if I knew the 3-step lesson plan. What shall I teach today? So I watched him teach a double lesson, as you do, with Year 9 on Penderecki's Threnody for the Victims of Hiroshima, off the top of his head, and then at the end of that he said, so that's how you do it, gave me his timetable, pointed out I had Year 12 next, and left. And that was my teacher training. As a youngster, I had 2 careers in mind. The first was to play cricket for England, and the second, to be a composer. I'm still waiting for my call up for England, but given that Australia have forgotten to play cricket, I'm wondering if I should make use of my dual nationality. The one thing I knew I wouldn't be was a teacher. Both my parents were teachers, Mum a primary teacher, early childhood specialist and later deputy principal at the Walney North Primary School off the coast of Cumbria, a suburb which at the time boasted the highest suicide rate of any in the UK, following the cancellation of the Trident submarine programme which was built at the local dockyards, and Dad, also a teacher, head of English for 20 years at the local comprehensive high school. And during the period that I grew up, that was the period when the Thatcher and the major governments pushed through educational reform after reform, making teachers' workloads and responsibilities more and more onerous. My sister returned from London one day where Mum had participated in a demonstration and marched up and down the living room yelling, "Maggie, Maggie, Maggie, out, out, out." Why would I have ever considered becoming a teacher? But Matthew called me, and one term at an independent school with a renowned music programme, the one that later featured in the documentary Mrs. Carey's Concert, well, I figured one term would be okay.
We stretch them to do it as best as they're mentally and physically able to.
Because I think they become better people having done it.
I think it's life-changing. Oh, I hope I'm not kidding myself. It is, it's life-changing.
And it was okay. Well, all right, I loved teaching there. I loved sharing my passion for music. I loved having, or finding that I had an instinct for how to break down complex and abstract ideas. I loved watching the light come on in children's eyes when they understood complicated things about music and they understood them through making it themselves. I loved that I taught in a department that put creativity at the centre of the curriculum and assessed music learning outcomes primarily through composition, my own personal favourite in music. I stayed 12 years and was only dragged away when I reached my next life ambition, which was to teach here. In that time, I was also lucky enough to work in many other schools, both public and independent, and to teach children from kindergarten to year 12. I worked on commissions for children with special needs and wrote a children's opera and a children's symphony, as well as dozens of smaller works for children. And I also got a proper teaching qualification. I don't think there's ever been a better time to be a music educator. It's an incredibly exciting time, in fact, but that doesn't mean that I think it's all necessarily plain sailing for music education, or for that matter, for the place of music in Australian society and curricula. In fact, all education is in turmoil, because there's a huge rift between what research is telling us we need to be doing for our children's best learning outcomes and the public and political rhetoric around education. Today, I hope to tie these little insignificant ideas together and to show that we musicians have an awful lot to offer the education debate. But what are we worried about to start off with? Well, in 88% of independent primary schools, but only 23% of government schools, music is taught by specialist teachers, despite the fact that it's mandated in all state curricula. On average, primary school teachers receive only 17 hours of mandatory music education in their undergraduate degrees. If we can compare that to Finland, where primary school teachers get 270 hours of music training, and South Korea, where they get 160 hours. By the way, we've come down from 200 hours, which used to be the norm in Australia. Recently, the Australian National University's Anita Collins has received great publicity for her work bringing together music education and brain development, allowing us to better advocate for music education for its own sake, not because it may make children just better at maths. We know that music contributes to students' cognitive development, including abstract thinking, oral and spatial awareness, and verbal understanding. Music contributes to students' rational thinking, reasoning, critical thinking, logistical thinking, and interpretive skills. This research and these slides were put together by Dick Letts and the Music Trust for a full deal advocacy program that I worked on last year. So we know that we do have an advocacy job in front of us, especially around music education in primary school age. We need to ensure that all Australian children are taught by trained music educators. It's for their best. Richard Gill has recently won some government support to put in place a mentoring program, which we hope may help the situation. There's another program which probably fewer of us are talking about. In high school music education in Australia, we do have specialist teachers, and teenagers love music. Campbell, Connell and Beagle write, "Music is omnipresent in the life of teens and affects their moods, dictates their fashions, influences their language and dominates their conversations, defining what and who is cool." And a wide range of research has shown us that 100% of high school students say that music is the most important part of their personal identity. That's not just one study, that's 6 or 7. But if so, why do only 5 to 7% of students in the US, where those studies came from, choose to study music all the way through high school? The statistic is the same in the UK. And the statistic is the same here in New South Wales and in other states in Australia, and even in many of the biggest schools with the biggest music programs. Getting students in with better education in primary school may be one answer to this problem, but it doesn't solve the problem we have right now, and one that's decades old. Our high school students love music, so we need to capture the motivation that they already have to learn music rather than putting them off music in a classroom context. Ethan Hine, here shown in what he calls his cowboy photo, a lecturer in technology and music education at New York University, identified the same problem and attributed it to the gap between the musical culture of the classroom and of students' own lives. Quote, "These low enrolment figures are startling when we consider the central role of music in the inner lives of adolescents. We should not blame students for voting with their feet if the music classes available to them do not offer what they want and need from music. Instead, we must ask why so many young people are alienated by their music education experience. And the answer? Classroom music is alien. The Music Academy," this is still Hine, just to make it clear it's not me standing in a conservatorium saying it, "The Music Academy continually laments students' lack of interest in legitimate art music and their preference for supposedly vacuous pop. From the students' perspective, however, there are valid reasons to find it difficult to connect to the music they encounter in most classrooms." Together with Green, Hine defined the cycle which perpetuates this gap in musical cultures, and nowhere could it be more evident than in many ways than in this institution and with people with the kind of background that I have a blooming art music composer. We've established that only 5 to 7% of students take music to the end of high school. A small minority may continue to study tertiary, and usually those are the Western art music students. Then an even smaller minority of those become music education graduates, or later qualified as music teachers, and they train the next generation, most of whom won't choose to study music. So, with my composer hat on, I've spent the last few years researching how we might take a more inclusive approach to creativity in music education, and I'm presenting a paper on this at the upcoming Asimov conference in September. In it, I compare the composition process of established composers, including interviews with Australian composers and songwriters, DJs and producers. And so I can quote myself. The modern DJ is a sophisticated musician, not an automated playbacker of tracks made by others. Consider a live DJ set. Before it begins, the DJ has collected and created samples, some of which may be short as individual sounds, some of which may be complete tracks by other artists, and has rehearsed combining these in ways that he and potentially her listeners will find interesting. On top of these samples, the DJ may create or improvise with synthesized or further sample data using MIDI controllers or dedicated hardware. Effects are not thought of in a studio, post-mixing or mastering way, but as options for live performance nuances, such as typical high-pass filter sweeping up towards a musical climax. Some DJs also perform live, acoustic instruments. Different genres of electronic music pose different expectations of tempi, timbres to be employed, keys and harmonic devices to be used, and structures to be followed. And every DJ carefully plans how to manipulate the listener by following, or not, these expectations. What about the broader background? In many ways, we need to consider that all education has changed, and there's a raft of research going on in this kind of field at the moment. The reason that all education has changed, or is in the process of having to consider change, is because learning has changed through the recent changes in technology. If you have one of these in your pocket, you may not have access to wisdom or understanding, but you definitely have access to a whole lot of information, and you can do things with those information. The literature shows that children live in a flattened world. At a young age, they are able to access information, entertainment, relationships, and project a version of their self-identity. There's a saying that I've always enjoyed: any teacher that can be replaced by a computer, this is another education expert, Asimov, many of you know the quote, should be replaced by a computer. Actually, since he was writing sci-fi, some decades ago, he didn't know that once we had the internet, actually it would be more something like this. But learning does happen that way, doesn't it? It happens even in music education to a great extent. After all, we know that there are many successful electronic musicians who are self-trained. Hugo Pierre Leclerc in this photo, Madian if you prefer DJ names, is now 19 years old, but he started writing electronic music aged 11. His live performance of his mashup Pop Culture went viral. It's had over 23 million hits on YouTube now, and then he was 17. Now he's an international DJ, just finished doing some production for Lady Jaja or something, I don't know. Leclerc taught himself English, and he taught himself music composition online, watching YouTube videos. But back to the broader questions in education and the shifting culture of how our children learn outside the classroom. Schools have done their best to keep up with changes in technology that have resulted in changes in the way children learn. But often our models for using technology in the classroom mirror not the way children learn at home, but the classrooms of old. So what does technology-enabled learning really look like? Research suggests that the key is not the technology itself, but the barrier to knowledge, information, or even creativity that technology has the potential to break down. In the tradition of Montessori or Dewey, experiential or constructivist learning means children build meaning from their own engagement with the world around them. I went to a talk a couple of years ago where Keith Trigwell at our own Institute of Teaching and Learning here at the University of Sydney reflected beautifully on one of the big questions of our time, around constructivist learning, and I'll let you read his quote. That was just so I could have some water. In fact, a wide range of research shows us that very often our children's deepest learning still looks just like this photo, children exploring the physical world that they live in. Technology's place in learning may not be as a silver bullet, but as that opening to information, to use a corporate catch cry, anywhere, anytime. Just as my 6-year-old was able to access the instructions for building his Lego truck when he lost them yesterday. There they were, on the internet. No need to cry. This is how I prefer to consider children's nearly ubiquitous access to technology and to information through technology. I find this worldview reflects the research in this field better than Prensky's divisive generational description of digital natives on one hand and digital immigrants, that's those of us more than about 25 years old, on the other. I also believe that such descriptions perpetuate the technology barrier excuse that teachers lacking confidence claim hold them back, even when mature teachers are able to be digital culture leaders, as has been shown in the literature. Such generalization of the generations also lacks cultural subtlety. So, the literature on this topic, it turns out, when we go deep, paints a very muddy picture, and indeed backs up my suggestion that this is a complicated time for education. As someone teaching pre-service teachers here at the Con, I feel a responsibility to present balanced research and literature in this field, even when results of studies are disparate and even contradictory. Anna Kraft identifies arising, contrasting and extreme worldviews of this recent transformation as childhood at risk versus childhood empowered. In other words, we can look at children's interaction with technologies from both of these different worldviews at once. Finding a balance, a path through the maze of contrasting research, is extremely difficult, but it's an important part of further developing our personal education philosophy. We deal with such issues in several courses here at the Con, but the one that I explore them most in is technology and music education. For instance, we begin this course by debating the middle ground, where the middle ground may be between Dimitri Christakis' and Sagata Mitra's work. I chose these two researchers because their research is not only persuasive, but they're brilliant public speakers, and I can't recommend their TED Talks highly enough, especially to those who don't enjoy reading journal articles. Christakis' best-known work is around the effect that children's educational DVDs, such as the Young Einstein series, have on children's development. Contrary to the claims on the DVD packaging, Christakis' research shows that making children watch these DVDs may slow brain development and lead to problems with attention later in life. Christakis' paediatric research also ranges across topics such as the effect of violence in video games on the behaviour of children, something which is still often debated in the press, but something where the research has been in for quite a while in the literature. Television viewing and sleep problems in toddlers. Internet addiction, yes, there is such a thing as internet addiction. Diet and obesity, alcohol advertising and deaths from harmful drinking, and the digital divide, another nod to Prensky's work. Reviewing Christakis' research does indeed fit with Kraft's first summarised worldview of childhood at risk around learning and technology. Why would we put any screen media in front of our kids if it's actually holding their learning back? And then next, we consider Sagata Mitra's hole-in-the-wall research, which I'm sure many of you know. So here's the short version, just for the few of you who may not. So Sagata Mitra was working in Delhi at a university in computer science, not in education. And he noticed that while there were thousands and thousands of kids in a slum really close to the university, that he wasn't teaching any of those children. And he reckoned there were probably some smart kids in there. It couldn't just be the rich kids who were clever enough to get into university. So he installed a computer in the wall of, in a wall facing out onto the slum, and went away for a couple of weeks. When he came back, he discovered kids from the slum who had taught themselves how to use the computer, how to get around the internet and do things with it. And indeed had taught themselves a whole new language, English, to do that in. So a few people suggested that there was nothing to the research that he published off the back of this, that probably there had been some computer science students walking past who taught this stuff to the students. So he headed out into a village a few hours away from Delhi and put a computer underneath a tree, gave it access to the internet, and again went away. When he came back, he asked the students how they were going. Again, they had worked out how to use the computer, they taught themselves English, they could get around it. And he said, you know, what do you think of the experience? And they said, oh, it's okay. And he said, why only okay? And they said, well, the computer needs a faster motherboard and more RAM. So then he gave them harder and harder tasks, and it turned out that a lot of these students could not only work out the language and not only work out how to use the computer and get around the internet, but they could do things which children much older than them would not normally only be expected to do. What you may not know is that Sugata Mitra's research goes on. What he's done now is he's taken that same research and he's put it in schools where he puts a computer, or I think it has to be one computer between 4 students in a classroom. Then he gives them a really difficult question, a question that's much above their sort of expected level of their age. And then he leaves and he makes sure the teacher leaves with him. And the early results from this research, which were published just in the last month, suggest that students learn more, retain more, and in both primary and secondary age groups are accelerating their learning by up to 7 years. That's 7 years over their expectations and the national standards in the UK. So, we have great examples of childhood at risk from technology and childhood empowered by technology. I'll give you a few more examples, and these are all taken from a book of cross-generational collaboration at Harvard, where Howard Gardner, which is the same Howard Gardner who wrote the multiple intelligences stuff for our education audience, and Katie Davis have written a book called The App Generation. And indeed, as they look at issues that rise from their research and related research, they discover the same kind of contradictions and the same opposing views arising. So why did they call it the app generation? Well, they argue, quote, "It's our argument that young people growing up in our time are not only immersed in apps, they've come to think of the world as an ensemble of apps, to see their lives as a string of ordered apps, or in many cases a single extended cradle-to-grave app. Whatever human beings might want should be provided by apps, and if the desired app doesn't yet exist, it should be devised right away by someone. And if no app can be imagined or devised, then the desire, or fear, or conundrum simply does not, or at least should not, matter." Those of you who have teenage children perhaps finding that this is starting to ring a few bells. Grouping the research into 3 arising topics, this is the first. They find that apps may, on one hand, foreclose a sense of identity, but on the other hand, they may promote a strong sense of identity. Strange contradiction. Well, it's documented between research showing that children present a polished up and not real version of themselves on social networks. Using Erickson's original formulation of a healthy identity, they found that young people are more likely to be pragmatic about the course of their life, quote, "more issue-oriented and less ideological, more individualistic, narcissistic, self-focused, a goal they have learned from the projected identity of the celebrity alongside a message that anyone can be a celebrity too." But on the positive front, the online identities children can adopt are much wider in range than those accepted in past decades. It's easier to come out online, to be a geek or a nerd online. Man, I wish I grew up 20 years later. Or to find others to share unusual interests. The horizons of children growing up in low-income families have shown to become much broader once they have access to the internet and to result in greater ambition. The next area that they look at is relationships. And again, they find what seems like a contradiction. Apps can encourage superficial relationships, yet they can also allow deep relationships. This is principally because the day-to-day communication in relationships has moved to apps. Our students communicate from the moment they wake, often to the moment they sleep, with research showing much of this communication is based on micro-coordination and hyper-coordination, making and breaking plans on the go, adjusted all day long. Quote, "The app mentality supports the belief that just as information, goods and services are always and immediately accessible, so too are people." But at the same time, they cite research that shows that youth have fewer close, trusting and intimate friendships, with their increasing communication actually resulting in social isolation. And probably of a little bit more interest today, their third aspect that they look at is creativity. They find that apps can, yes, you guessed it, stunt creative imagination, and that they can also stimulate creativity. Well, moving back towards music education, some nice ideas arrive. They consider the remix movement that has been enabled by internet and by apps designed to make remixing or remaking easy and spontaneous. They cite the wide range of views on whether remixing is really a creative process at all, led by computer scientist and cultural critic Jérôme Lanier's manifesto, "You Are Not a Gadget," and where he equates the expressive limitations of MIDI, the language used to communicate musical notes between a computer and another, with limitations ipso facto of all computer music. Well, I would suggest that there has been way too much good music composed and performed within those limitations that Lanier suggests, not to mention insightful texts written on how emerging music technology has been used incredibly creatively. But Gardner and Davies do point out some good examples on the lack of control of sound children often have when composing in new apps, and the potential this has to limit creative thinking. And again, they point out the positive effect apps have had on creativity, especially providing opportunities for children from low-income families to have access to creative forms they wouldn't have had before, something Seymour Papert and Mitch Resnick called lowering the floor, raising the ceiling, and widening the walls for young creators. However we look at it, learning has changed. It's doubtless changed, and our children's cultures have changed, and more change is on the way. So what can we conclude? We need to carefully pick our way through this changing environment where there is no one clear answer. In 2009, I was lucky enough to meet David Price. With a long record of work in community music, a period as the director of LIPA, or the Paul McCartney Performing Arts School if you prefer, as its first director, Price became one of the leaders in the musical futures movement, which sought to revolutionise and rekindle classroom music education. The pedagogy developed was based on Green's seminal texts on informal learning, and follow-up research showed that 2 to 3 times the number of students became engaged in, enjoyed and succeeded in music education in the trial schools. This kind of research and practice connection has not been so exemplified in music education pedagogical development since the work of the so-called creative music movement of the 1960s, 70s and 80s. David's recent work has grown from his experiences with musical futures to apply those on informal learning to all education more broadly, and it's explored in his recent book, Open. David was in Australia recently, and I had an opportunity to interview him for my technology and music education course about his findings that he's published in this book. If there's a big takeaway from your book for readers, what would it be?
I guess the optimistic message behind the book is that to put it in a single sentence, I believe that the open exchange of ideas and information's got the capacity to change the world for a better place. The downside is that that's also having a huge impact on, you know, what's been termed the knowledge economy. And that is affecting the amount of jobs which are being created, and it's radically changing the world that our students are going to be entering after school and after university. And I wrote the book because I think this is a conversation that's not really being had in political circles or between policymakers.
This interview is one of many that I'm creating for the Technology and Music Education course. And as some of you may know, a few months ago this course was chosen by the University of Sydney to become one of its first MOOCs, a free open online course at coursera.org that anyone can take. I'm hoping it will be useful not just for pre-service music educators, but for existing educators who are interested in learning some new technology skills and thinking about how they might apply some of the most recent thinking about education in their music classrooms. Advert over. Price is not the only one writing about the new skills students need to develop for the careers they are likely to have, and about the irrelevance of our standards-based and testing-based school systems. In many ways, the ideas of these authors converge again around a call for a Deweyan constructivist approach to teaching and learning, with outcomes relevant to the cultures that our students live in. In another word of Harvard scholarship, Tony Wagner's 2012 text, Creating Innovators, considers the careers of those innovating in our time, and points out that school wasn't the main source of their education. In fact, every one of the leaders who he picks actually dropped out of school and forged careers in industries that their parents probably couldn't have imagined might exist so soon. Edwin Land of Polaroid, Bill Gates of Microsoft, and Mark Zuckerberg of Facebook all went to Harvard and all dropped out of Harvard. Larry Ellison of Oracle, Michael Dell of Dell Computers, and Steve Jobs of Apple all also dropped out of their colleges. And so clear themes arise. We don't want chalk and talk. We don't want teaching to the test. We don't want to base new classrooms on the old. We want to use technology, but we know it isn't a silver bullet. And we want hands-on experiential learning with real-world outcomes, relevance, and skills that our children can see will benefit them immediately in life, or at least appear directly relevant to their lives. But, as is so often true, public and political discourse is not even close to what this research is suggesting. Only a few days ago, the press went into another frenzy over NAPLAN results, further encouraging parents to demand teaching to the test. And meanwhile, one of my students pointed out that education expert, I had no idea, Miranda Devine, had written an opinion piece criticising Hurlstone Agricultural School's progressive move away from exam and test and exam directed instruction. And while our federal education minister has had some useful ideas, not least his recent support of Richard Gill's new plan for music teaching mentors, his recent 4 Pillars of Education article for the Australian newspaper begins by bemoaning PISA, the international equivalent of NAPLAN results, and then establishing as his first pillar the primary importance of eliminating politically correct thematic requirements that ignored real educational needs. But real educational needs of the kind I've outlined so far are not to be found in the 3 remaining pillars. The debate is ideological rather than being based on what we know. Phew. There is light at the end of the tunnel. As well as great research, there are institutions putting these ideas into practice, and it's working. In 2012, I was lucky enough to go on a field trip to a school. And it was a school that David Price had assured me was one of the best examples of all of this good stuff actually happening in practice, something that was answering these things that the research was suggesting we need. The rather awkwardly named High-Tech High. Yeah, okay, it was in America. But it's actually an awkward title because the school is not about high-tech. They actually just thought it would make a really, really nice sounding name. In fact, the entire curriculum at this school, maths doesn't take part in it, but nearly the entire curriculum is based on project-based learning. In fact, High-Tech High is more than one school. It's actually 12 schools based on the same model. 5 high schools, 4 middle schools, and 3 elementary or primary schools as we'd call them. Each one is kept below the 500 student mark because it is believed that's as many names as a teacher can remember and therefore engenders a sense of community. And while the schools operate under the same principles, personalisation, adult world connection, common intellectual mission and teacher as designer, the flavour of each I found was distinct. As a charter school, the places have to be offered by lottery, so there are an even mix of students of different socioeconomic status, including those from the poorest areas around San Diego, yet since opening in 2000, 98% of its graduates have gone on to college, 75% into 4-year degrees, and the pride these students showed in their school and learning backed up the impression that there were next to no dropouts. And if those statistics don't mean much to us here in Australia, we can compare their 98% of students going on to college with the 66% national average and a national 6.6% dropout rate. So it's not just a great model of 21st century, it's a successful one. The strongest and most impressive character, and boy there were a few, that I met at High Tech High was an art teacher called Jeff Robin. Jeff had been at the school since the beginning and had very strong feelings about how to do project-based learning right. This is one of his animations. What is PBL?
Project-based learning goes something like this. You figure out what you want the students to learn. It could be the standards or it could be your own creation, and you develop a project. You reverse engineer the content into the project. Then you do the project yourself. That way you know the pitfalls, you know what the deliverables are going to be, you know what tasks are involved. Then you introduce it to the students, and then you move forward and you have a management scheme to get the students to do their work. You want to design it so that nobody falls through the cracks and nobody games the system. You know how to support them because you've done it yourself, and through revision and critique, you create a beautiful project. Then it's exhibition. You really need to have an exhibition because that's what makes it real. The students should be done at least a week or two before exhibition, so you have time to think about it, time to review your work, time to talk about it. In between finishing the project at exhibition night, you can do a lot of different things. You could show your work to other student groups. You can show a movie to your students that has something to do with your project. You could do reading or research or even a lecture to talk about things that you maybe feel like you didn't cover enough, but you really wanted to hit on and the project didn't allow you to. And then on exhibition night, everybody's cool, calm, and collected, and they have a beautiful exhibition. And just one more thing. Do the project yourself. Do the project yourself. It'll pay off huge in the end if you just do the project yourself first.
So there's a subtle point that you might not have got in that presentation. The work that Jeff and his classes produced was absolutely incredible. The way that they work at the school is that they pair, say, in this case, an art teacher and a science teacher together, and they do the project themselves first, put together their research. Most of their work is published or presented to the local community or has some kind of public impact so that it all has meaning to the students. You can see where that fits in with what the research was suggesting we need. So I was pretty inspired. I hadn't worked out quite what it meant for music education in Australia, but I headed back. And, well, they say nowadays that we need to encourage our students to fail frequently. Fail well, and boy did I fail. The first project that I put together was together with the art department and the science department, and it was pretty terrible for music, I reckon. My students did okay in the music classes, but when I went to watch the resulting 6-minute documentaries, I only think I actually heard any music that they'd composed in one of them. Meanwhile, the art teacher dropped out of the project, so that third of it didn't happen at all. Another project that I started to work on worked much better. I'd actually been working on a composition myself. I was using ideas of musical cryptography as the base of a piece that was going to be performed at the school, looking at, for instance, Bach's final contrapunctus from the Art of Fugue, how he'd hidden his name, similar things from Bach's time, the whole way through to popular music ideas for hiding messages in music. And having come up with these ideas, I decided to go and share some of them with different departments. And it turned out that the maths department were really excited about this because it came up with different ways of hiding number patterns and things, and they designed a, yes, I did the project myself, I composed the music. They designed a way of using some of the things that we were going to hide in the music to hide angles in reflection patterns. And this is a little tutorial movie that I created to show students how they could take the code from their angles in their maths work and use it to create a soundtrack. Since the angles came up with a nice geometric pattern and the music came up with lovely sounding music, we could put those together as installation pieces. I I was also really proud of this, not only because we got a lot out of it and the maths teachers liked it, but because Jeff Robin had told us that maths teachers wouldn't work with anyone else. So it was a real success. But while creating engaging cross-curricular projects was good, I wasn't convinced that music as accompaniment to another subject could be as powerful as or as deep as just music learning for music's sake. And I think that might be the key. I remembered that over dinner on my final evening at High Tech High, I was raving about the music program at my school, which, amazed as I was by the High Tech High, these schools didn't match in any way. I was describing how in my music program we had truly integrated the curricular and extracurricular music programs by basing the classroom content on the repertoire being performed in our choirs, orchestras, bands, the school musical, and so on, with assessment on their detailed understanding of the repertoire achieved by assessing their compositional responses to these models. Assessing knowledge through creativity. A High Tech High teacher listened to how we rewrote the curriculum every 6 months to meet the repertoire, how we blended learning about music with the act of making music, and how it all came together in a series of concerts and composition workshops, and he said, well, that's best practice project-based learning right there. Another epiphany in my thinking about music education was to consider the role of the teacher, the part we play in our classroom, at least when we teach music well. This dawned on me a few months after leaving the US, when the school choir and the chamber orchestra put on a Christmas concert at the local church and performed Britain's Ceremony of Carols and Bach's Magnificat. As I lost myself in the end-of-year exhaustion, brilliant performance, and sublime composition, the programme fell open on my lap and some words stood out. As well as spending a lot of time thinking about music education, I'd been thinking about my own career. It had been troubling me that although I'd composed entirely to commission for about a decade, that increasingly I was becoming that guy who composes for kids, and not the concert or art music composer I'd set out to be. And the words that stood out from the programme reminded me that Bach wrote the first version of the Magnificat in his first year as the Thomas Cantor in Leipzig, that he revised it several times in the 27 years that he spent at the Thomasschule teaching and composing. I'm not sure they had cars and vans out the front when he was there, but it also served to remind me that we'd heard the music of Britain first that evening, whose passion for writing music for children gave permission, in my opinion, to many serious art music composers in Britain to do similar. And of Holst, before Britain, who spent 29 years at St Paul's School and 17 at Morley College before that, and who commented, that remark of Shaw is not essentially true. Teaching is not an alternative to doing. Teaching is doing. Music in itself is already, in at least one sense, cross-curricular. If not, why do we need such a wide range of tertiary music educators, be they musicologists, composers, performers, or the myriad of other specialist skills required? We mix theory with art, emotion with understanding. We are the ultimate in experiential educators. And why? Well, consider Jeff Robin's advice. Do the project yourself first. How many instrumental teachers would teach repertoire they don't already know? How many teachers would set composition tasks they couldn't do? How many would try to teach music without the actual musical experience, be it playing, singing, moving, improvising, or composing? Only poor, lazy music teachers would do that. We musicians know beauty. We all know excellence. We all know from our own musical studies how much hard work it takes to achieve it and how much that hard work is worth it. What music has given us personally as human beings and what it can give our students. We always do the project ourselves. First, we are musicians. We are artists. Innovation is in our bones too. There's the composer's search for an original, distinct voice, whatever their chosen compositional style. There's the wide range of interpretation of single works by so many talented performers. There's the unlocking of the thoughts behind the music, the secrets of sound, the stories behind the stories of music and musicians. And that's just the start. Consider the development of musical instruments over hundreds of years, an innovation that moves on faster now in both the acoustic and the electronic worlds than ever before. And consider the music teacher who tells you, "Oh, I'm rubbish with technology," and then explains to their school's IT staff what the problem with the audio driver is. And teaches a Year 7 about a computer language called MIDI that will allow them to transmit and capture information about music and turn it into a soundtrack for a film. We're especially good at this in Australia. Therefore, what we need to do to join the musical cultures of our Western art music trained music educator, yep, me and many of you, and those of our students who really do want to learn about music, is take such a pluralist approach. Something many of us already do, and something I've written about in the recent Oxford University Press's, or the upcoming Oxford University Press's, Handbook of Technology and Music Education. We musicians have a great history of embracing innovation. All we've got to do is be open-minded about what music is and to new definitions of how it can be made, especially around the technology-rich lives of our children. The DJ is a musician. It really is an incredibly exciting time to be a music educator. We are lucky because our chosen field of education, when taught well, naturally has so many of the elements of learning that those in education more broadly are trying to synthesize. So, I'm going to leave you today with a challenge. Let's stop apologetically advocating just for a place in education policy for music. Let's advocate that our model should be the one to lead all education into the 21st century. Thank you.
But before the questions start, I just want to make sure that you're all aware that after the lecture, there's an opportunity to continue less formal questions to our presenter and chat amongst yourselves about the topics with the free refreshments that will be available afterwards. So you just go out the door, turn left, and you'll find there's some welcoming refreshments there. I also just want to mention the next couple of weeks. So next week we have Kay Dreyfus from Monash University, who'll be talking about Alma Moody, a virtuoso violinist who we all need to know more about. And the following week will be Oliver Bone, who is formerly of the Design Lab at the University of Sydney, now at UNSW, and he's going to be talking about some similar sorts of things around the role of new music technology and the potential for creativity. That lecture is going to be at the Seymour Centre. So unlike the rest of the lectures in this series, which are all held here, that particular one will be at the Seymour Centre. There's information on our website about how to locate the room if you need it. Okay, so on to some questions for James. Yes?
Yeah, I've been a big Orff fan for quite a while. I gave a presentation at the recent New South Wales Orff teaching conference talking about how the Orff approach and possibly both popular and post-minimalist film music might sit in between, in that diagram where I've sort of got the question mark and I'm suggesting a pluralist approach to music education, where I suggested that there's actually an existing pedagogy that would sit beautifully right there in the middle. So I think, you know, in fact some of my students are working on compositions around that idea at the moment.
I was wondering, when you've been sending out another showing the project-based learning, was there any indication, or did they actually advocate for specific ones of facilitation in the learning process, and what the teachers exactly do as the students starts that process of learning themselves and putting the projects together?
Yeah, brilliant question. So this is definitely true at High Tech High, and I've observed it at a few other places. From the student's point of view, a project can seem quite open, but in actual fact, it's massively scaffolded behind the scenes. Jeff said that what he works out is that an hour of his work on a project is about a day in a classroom. And so when they finished doing the project, the two teachers, they look at what the processes were, what all the pitfalls were, and plan that out. So when the students walk in, they might have a question. One of the questions, they had a presentation of learning when I was there, and the students had built various war machines. And I think their question had been, you know, investigate and build a war machine from this period or from, you know, these years. And so the students, and that seems very open to the students, and off they go. But actually, if you look on the wall, there was a calendar, and it sort of said, you know, in week 3, you'll explain what the machine is you're hoping to build and, you know, what it was used for. And so there's a bunch of research expected to be done by that point. And then 3 weeks later, they had to do a cardboard mock-up, and 3 weeks after that, they were going to... And also, I think quite often Jeff there builds into his process for doing this always some time at the end of the project in case you do want to sort of do some traditional didactic teaching. But actually a lot of that stuff happens along the way. If you want kids to, I was saying this in a lecture earlier today, if you want kids to make catapults, they can't make them out of balsa wood because when they wind them up they'll just implode. So they need to have those woodwork lessons and look at structures and things. So my experience was, in fact, that the more open the project seemed to the students, the more heavily and carefully scaffolded it actually was behind the scene.
When there was information missing or bits and pieces of the puzzle that's missing, is the teachers there to actually say to them, okay, hold on, there's something missing. What are you missing? Look at it again.
Yeah.
Was there anything like that in place as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So the reading through a lot of the literature, and there's so much, you know, it's a absolutely huge field, but a sort of recurrent theme is the changing role of the teacher, and I hate that, moving from sage on the stage to guide on the side. I mean, it sort of makes me feel a bit, but it is absolutely true, as the way our children learn and the way they're accustomed to learn outside the classroom is allowed to come into the classroom, that the role of the teacher does have to change. And, you know, we're not anymore the person who's standing up at the front of the room with all the knowledge, and they're sort of sitting there like vessels to be filled with our brilliance. And we you know, unfortunately, we can't just be that great person anymore. So it does change, but I think that, there's one of my favourite books on project-based learning is An Ethic of Excellence by Ron Berger. And in that book, he talks about the importance of repeated drafts or, you know, repeated prototypes through the creative and the learning process, and the idea of very highly structured peer critique and teacher critique in that process, so that students, you know, they don't ever finish with good enough. There's always another level, and they learn to actually expect excellence. His theory is that would fix lots of problems with that go on in you know, lower socioeconomic schools where you've got you know, problems with attendance and behaviour and things like that. And there's already some research going on at a school near Parramatta on that as well.
Look, I can talk about this all day, so
Over a glass of wine in a minute, yeah.
Yes. I just want to make a comment about the person you mentioned, Price. It seems that there's quite a few people like that who are suggesting that maybe a lot of jobs are going to go because of technology, robots and things like that. George Siemens, who's an advocate of MOOCs, etc., says actually it's really quite positive that we're probably likely to have more universities and more different kinds of jobs and more specialisations. And so I think you have to be careful about being too pessimistic about what technology might end up being.
Yeah, absolutely, I totally agree. And it's another great example of these sort of contradictory viewpoints or research results from studies. We have to consider them all and accept that they can actually both be right. And it's just a kind of, yeah, an interesting period that we're in. Yeah.
Any other questions? What about blind and deaf people, blind and deaf whole lot of areas to sort of get over into this field. How do you deal with people who want to, you know, and have you got anything for those sort of people with their deafness and their blindness, various other disabilities?
Yeah, I mean, it's not something that I talked about today, but there's a huge field of practice and research around how technology is changing education and I guess resulting aspirations for people with disabilities, such as blindness. I was lucky enough to work on the development of some music notation software called Sibelius over a number of years. And one of the things that we did was work with a company that created a version of Sibelius that could tell a blind user which bar they were in, and what they could add to the music and orchestrate it. And I was working with a Sydney jazz musician, Marie Steinway, who was able for the first time, she said, to actually compose a piece of music, print out the parts and walk into a rehearsal and hand them to players. And you know, in the past you'd always had to have someone transcribe her ideas for her. So I mean, there are many transformational, amazing stories about how technology is, and we get onto prosthesis, it's, you know, the same again. So yeah, it's another fascinating, interesting field.
We have time for one more question. If nobody else has one, I will ask
Okay.
a question. James, do you have anything that you can share with us about your MOOC?
Oh, right.
I'd love to hear more about that.
Yeah, okay. So MOOC stands for Massively Open Online Course. I'm happy to do another sales job on it. It's quite interesting because you would think you could just take a university unit of study and plonk it into an online course by just sort of videoing those lectures. But we've been working with Coursera, which is the company where we're going to publish it. And we've been able to look at their metrics from the last 3 or 4 years of doing this. So we know things such as if you talk at people in online videos for much more than about 5.5 minutes, they switch off. And so it's a completely different way of delivering what hopefully will still be the same content. But we're going to be breaking it down into a bunch of shorter MOOCs. So the first MOOC is really going to be provocations. As I hope you got tonight, it's not like I have one opinion that I think is completely right about all these different contradictory things that are going on in education, but I think it's really important for us to consider them. So the first MOOC is going to set out a lot of those ideas, and then the second and the third MOOC are going to be skills-based. So you know, anyone who does the MOOC will know how to do things like audio recordings and how to create templates for lessons and all that kind of practical music education with technology stuff, even down to filming with multiple angles and things like that. And then in the later sections, we pull that together with projects, and we invite teachers and students to propose their own projects with music technology and peer mark them and things like that. So it's a kind of a mix of philosophy and research background, but also very practical skills and sort of best practice examples.
So when will that be?
Good question. Next week? No. I mean, you know, everybody says when you get into things like video editing, you have to start multiplying time schedules by 4. I'm really hopeful that it'll be up by the end of the year, or even sooner. But you know, we'll see. Yeah.
Okay. Well, thanks very much for a fascinating lecture and for pointing us to some really interesting resources. So please join me in thanking James.